Meditations with Ryan Slomek.
Aloha and welcome to episode 19 of Meditations. I'm your host, Ryan Zlomek, and this is a show dedicated to making space for conversation with interesting people just to see what kind of interesting and useful knowledge we can pick up along the way. We've had inventors and pop culture historians and journalists and consultants and musicians and everyone in between on this show. And today is going to be an extra awesome episode as we have Nate Powell on today's broadcast. Nate Powell is the award-winning cartoonist for the March trilogy, which he did about the civil rights movement with Congressman John Lewis and Andrew Ayden. A remarkable piece of work that won them the National Book Award, the only graphic novel that's ever won the National Book Award. But Nate has some other interesting stuff up his sleeve. He was in a punk band called the Soophie Nun Squad that was based in Arkansas. And now in Indiana, he's doing independent graphic novels, including his most recent book, Fall Through. So if you're interested in graphic literature, if you're interested in activism, if you're interested in just the quirky nature of the punk and hardcore scene, or you just want some insight into it, today is your day. This episode is for you. So without further ado, let's listen to Nate Powell. Nate Powell, I can't tell you how excited I am to have you on the show today. Thanks for joining.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Where are you beaming in from today?
I live in Bloomington, Indiana, which is in South Central Indiana. It's kind of a little nominally progressive college town surrounded by Indiana. And here I am. Yeah, I'm originally from Arkansas, but I've lived here for 20 years.
Well, that's one of the things I was curious about is you've kind of embraced that, middle America part of your life. As I look at the different places you've lived and, living in Little Rock and living in Indiana, you were in New York for a little while for college, but you've kind of always made your way back to middle America. And I'm curious, what's the intrigue and the pull of that part of the country?
A lot of it is really seeing it through a lens of so much young adult mobility. Before you settle, before you come up with a system that works for you in terms of justifying whether or not all of the effort of uprooting yourself and moving to a new home, of starting again, whether that's actually worth it. But when you're 18 to 25, there's a lot less preventing you from taking a chance on a new place. I grew up in an Air Force family during the 80s. And so I moved around a lot as a kid. And then my family settled back in Arkansas, where they were stationed. My family was stationed before I was born. And my parents loved Arkansas so much that as soon as my dad retired, we moved back there. And I went to college in New York for cartooning and moved around New England a little bit in the early 2000s. But generally, I got kind of burned out on a particular kind of Northeast stress, in addition to what is, in retrospect, kind of young adult punk faux intellectual play acting. That was very heightened, particularly, I think, in my age group immediately after 9/11 and with the launch of the Forever Wars, and just trying to handle what all of this meant with sort of the collapse of that very 90s personal is political sensibility. And so with that realignment, it was kind of a raw time. And I knew that Bloomington was a great place. I had friends who lived there. And through touring with Soophie Nun Squad, I'd already been there a bunch. I was comfortable and I was close enough to my family back in Arkansas without moving all the way back to Arkansas. And I was like, oh, this is fine for now. Thinking that, maybe in 6 months I would move somewhere else, and then life just happens.
That's so funny. I gotta ask for a definition of Northeast stress. Because I'm really curious about that as a Northeasterner. How do you I always say this, whenever you step into a different culture, which, America's full of a million of them,
Yeah.
What is it about the Northeast sort of vibes that didn't gel with you long term or didn't have sustainability?
I think a lot of it is simply as a Southerner, it took a while for me to recognize that Northeasterners are not actually rude. There's a different set of cultural expectations in terms of, or social expectations conversationally, and how you spend your time and energy, but also how people blow off stress. You know, like, so like living in the Northeast corridor, like living in Rhode Island and living, you know, in Massachusetts and going back and forth to work and stuff, you know, like getting a very different sense of like how chunks of your time that are expected to be spent in some kind of group aggression, like on the road or on the street or whatever. And it's funny because, you know, like in the Northeast, also, people have a different relationship to honking, for example. And like being in a traffic jam in New York City or in Boston or something, you'll hear a lot more honking than you will like back in Arkansas, let's say. But if you look at the faces of people stuck in traffic honking, oftentimes they're just totally tranquil. Honking is how they get it all out. And then, you know, like it's funny, like the adjustment period was so wild once I moved to the Northeast and moved and went back to Arkansas to visit. And this is like, you know, as like a 19 or 20-year-old, and realizing like, oh, yet at home, if you look at a dude in a pickup truck the wrong way, he will go out of his way to stop and beat you up. Like there's an entirely different expectation of people simply being allowed to engage with each other at all. And so in general, it was just a lot of like, just a lot of like hectic stress that I needed as like a 25-year-old to be like, you know, this might not be the best environment for the other personal, professional, all kinds of stuff going on in my life. I'm just going to go back to like cozy town for a while.
That's cool. I mean, it's also just interesting that like you came with that perspective, you know, that like you came from this just this understanding, or not even like you, how let me phrase this. You came from a place where like you were able to recognize some like those nuances, as opposed to not everybody does, you know, like you can't
Oh,
get
for
other places
sure.
and you're like, oh, everybody at McDonald's is the same.
Well, yeah, especially in the way that, you know, we accept this sort of like, you know, shorthand version of understanding different cultural pockets, you know, throughout the United States or elsewhere, as a means by which to be able to relate to people and talk about things, but you lose so much of the nuance and so many of the exceptions to the rule. Uh, and I don't know, I guess a lot of that, you know, like kind of blowing past that had to do with touring around a lot as an 18 to 25-year-old and getting to constantly be seeing my expectations of certain people, certain places, certain contexts be defied, you know, at every turn, both, you know, to the positive and to the negative. But it sort of helped cut down the sort of like monolithic sense of what it means to be a Southerner, or a Midwesterner, or a New Englander, or whatever.
Yeah, so let's use that as a nice segue. You know, for most people, they know you as Nate Powell, cartoonist, and rightly so. I think of you as Nate Powell, punk rocker, who happens to be a cartoonist, and I'm really curious about different sort of punk and hardcore scene cultures that exist just around the globe. And growing up in Little Rock, Arkansas, like you do a really cool job in Fall Through about talking about like the Sex Pistols coming into you know, like having a series of different shows that people kind of blew out of proportion. But as that being the catalyst that was sort of needed to develop these like little, yeah, punk and hardcore pockets around these areas that previously hadn't been known for aggressive music. And I'm curious about like when you were growing up, what was the community like in Little Rock, Arkansas? Like what was that scene like?
Well, what's so utterly unique and has only gotten, you know, like in the present tense and also in retrospect, even more precious and unique about Arkansas is that because it is largely devoid of a lot of like resources and accessible cultural reference points, if you want something cool to happen, you still pretty much have to make it happen yourself. And so even outside of the framework of punk, for young people, do it yourself was really like primed to be the way to get things done. And in Little Rock, like we were very late to punk, relatively speaking, because in general, because the Sex Pistols circumnavigated the state of Arkansas, played like Memphis, Louisiana, a couple shows in Texas, Tulsa, and moved on. All those places immediately developed this sort of punk environment. But we didn't have our first punk show in Little Rock till '86. And I kind of became aware of it in 1991 as like a young nerdy metalhead or whatever. But what's cool about Little Rock was, it's a mid-sized city without the benefits of being a college town or really having a strong college presence at all. So there wasn't a lot of turnover of, just like new young people all the time and new ideas and everything. So for the kids who grew up there, if you wanted something cool to happen, you had to figure out a way to make it happen yourself. But the revelation is that there are other people doing the same thing at the same time as you. In terms of punk, not only like I was already drawing comics and getting started trying to self-publish them, but then to realize there were these other teenagers already going to shows who were not only drawing comics, but like making zines and like giving me sort of like opening my perspective on what print output could be. And also like the punk world, like the punk community, in order to have enough people have a critical mass to kind of be healthy and make things happen, it meant that punk shows often had to overlap with the hip hop scene, with the metal scene, with the art scene. And then eventually, by the turn of the millennium, these fully became one expansive community, which is when the magic really starts happening.
That's interesting. So it wasn't until kind of the late 90s, early 2000s that you feel it like Little Rock had like a kind of like a sustainable punk scene?
No, I think it was actually sustainable by the time I became a part of it in late '91. The difference was that there were these other micro undergrounds and these other groups of younger people who were also on these parallel paths figuring it out. And some of those scenes might have had 8 people in them or might have had 20. Like what I'll say is the actual punks of Arkansas are the kind of like swamp metal community, which is like Arkansas is pretty well known for its like indie metal scene. And some of the strangest and most incredible music actually comes from the underground metal world. So there's this constant dynamic tension where like that was the first time I was aware of like a pecking order among misfits and like punk snobbery, things like that, of like punk defining itself by not being the metal guys, but always being like, but half of you guys go to the metal shows too. So what's this weird attitude? And so like that's a lot of it is like it was thriving by the early 90s, but it was a matter of kind of actually, like you can talk the talk, but it took all of the 90s to be able to kind of internalize that we were already part of this thing together. Let's embrace that instead of trying to fall back on, like exceptionalism and exclusion.
Yeah, and there's enough time for generations of people to come in and the ones that are going to be the movers and the shakers to stay there. What was the what types of spaces were you guys occupying? Like what types of venues were you guys throwing shows at? Or I saw something about what is it, the first Soophie Nun Squad show was like at a politician's backyard or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Our first, like, it was real strange, obviously, but there's this 9-band show that was in the backyard of the Arkansas governor's mansion. This is like 3 months after Bill Clinton went to the White House. But Jim Guy Tucker, the next governor, his daughter was a part of the scene, went to high school with a bunch of bands. And basically, she was like, Dad, can I have a party at our house, the governor's mansion? And he's like, okay, on a Sunday afternoon, that's fine, or whatever. And so she's like, he said yes to a party and just starts calling up bands. And she's like, yeah, it was wild. Made the front page of our very first show. An awful performance, very sad. But the next morning, the show was on the front page of the paper, and Soophie Nun Squad was one of the 3 bands listed by name. It was like the bands had names like Nuisance, Lime Pit, and Soophie Nun Squad. And I'm like, oh, we made it. We made it to the mountaintop. But like in general, like there was one actual venue that was a bar, which still allowed people under 21 to come in and do shows and stuff. And that was a regular, like it's a venue called Vino's, and it's still around. It's still central to the creative community and everything. However, it's important to place this within the realm of like the Nirvana Nevermind to Green Day Dookie sort of corporate takeover of more successful punk bands. And so during those early 90s, sort of restructuring of what it means to be a part of the punk underground in order to have things on our own terms, especially just being a bunch of high schoolers, it was important to like so much of Little Rock was utterly ignored by the people in charge, or really there just weren't eyes on a lot of things. So many of our shows were outdoors in ignored public parks and public spaces that still had running electricity. So yeah, they were outdoors, they were public, they were free, and almost entirely relied on pass the hat donations, and they were usually illegal. And so like there was just a many years long back and forth with the police and the city government itself in terms of who would actually like look the other way, or who would accept our forged permits to use the space or whatever. But a lot of it, like, it involved this constant search for new potential places to be exploited or to be enjoyed, because no one else was really exploiting these publicly available spaces, period. And I think that was a really defining aspect, was not just were we trying to figure out and make our own thing, but we were reconsecrating these free spaces and redefining what they meant as public property, as shared physical space.
Yeah, it's like I think one thing that doesn't get talked enough about whenever anybody tries to talk about like the academia of punk rock or whatever that means, but like the idea that like that partnership between a group of people and a city, or a group of people and some sort of space that like benefits from them being there, is like what is often the defining moment of any of these communities, because you've got this youthful population who are coming in and doing something that usually isn't that chaotic. It's completely overblown, but you need to be able to have that partnership in order to ensure like, hey, we can do a show at this at this park, and like the kind of like nod to the local authorities is like, it's a safe place. Like, no, we're not there's people aren't bringing heroin to these spaces. Like,
Right.
it's going to be okay. Like in Syracuse, like around the like late 90s, early 2000s, we had a community center that would let us do rock shows, and that became like a parents felt comfortable dropping their kids off at a community center. It was just a big open space, and it became this sort of like central tenet of a community. Down the road was the bar where some bigger shows would take place, where you needed the liquor license, and nobody really acknowledged that IDs existed, and that place had its
Sure.
like short-lived thing. And then you've got the bigger rock club, which the Lost Horizon was the one that we have, like where the bigger shows will happen, like depending on what's happening. But like with that scalability was what made Syracuse a sort of like a thriving scene around that time.
For
Uh,
sure.
and like in Syracuse, I'm excited to talk to you about straight edge later. But like, we were
That,
known as.
that that's where I was headed mentally as well.
Absolutely, and we'll get there. But what I'm curious about is I'm curious about like what types of bands, like what types of places were permeating those communities, like what bands were coming in to play and bring their culture to Little Rock once you guys had these spaces figured out.
Um, Oftentimes it depended on who was on whose shared phone list, you know? And so for our elder generation, which really we're talking about kids 3 years older than ourselves, um, they forged a lot of those connections. And like kids 3 years before that would be like the two biggest early bands from Little Rock were Econochrist, who then moved to the East Bay in California and became a very influential hardcore band. Could not wait to get outside of Arkansas. I don't blame them. But then also Trusty, who toured around a lot and then decided to move to Washington, D.C. in 1992. And so a lot of influence, but also contact from DC and from the San Francisco Bay then impacted who was phoning up kids in Little Rock to come through on their tours. So yeah, we were a scene that was very much equally influenced by Discord Records and by the Gilman Street project scene out of the Bay. For our generation, like I was 15 when the first issue of Heart Attack came out, which was Ebullition Records self-published quarterly 64-page fanzine that was sort of a more underground alternative to Maximum Rock and Roll, and ran for about a decade. But importantly, in a pre-internet, pre-cell phone world, a lot of the record reviews, the teeny tiny classified ads and small 1/6 of a page ads for records and bands became the contact point by which my generation, as 16 to 20-year-olds, were then accessing like-minded individuals. And so what really kind of blew it up was really in 1993 when Chino Horde out of Little Rock went on tour with Current for about 6 weeks, and every single connection that happened over the course of that tour was then echoed by an influx of bands that had also played on the road with all of those bands. So a lot of bands from like San Diego and from the Bay Area, but then also from the Northeast, like the entire realm from like Richmond, Virginia, up through New York City, sort of began weaving Little Rock into this network of destinations throughout the 1990s. And that really maintained itself throughout the 1990s.
That's cool. Any sort of specific shows or bands that kind of stand out to you as like just monumental for you, like bands you got to see in your own town?
Oh, I mean, certainly, like a lot of these would be like, there are moments where like, there are a few shows where I'm pretty sure I saw a really consequential band like Spitboy. And then there are these other shows, and I was just talking to somebody in Arkansas about this a few days ago, because so much of Fall Through has to do with the ways we sort of like overwrite and streamline our memories, so that by mythologizing these important local shows or moments, sometimes we catch ourselves weaving ourselves into shows we didn't attend, and we're like, oh, I'm fooling myself. For me, one of those on the other end of the spectrum, a massively influential scene moment in terms of a show and a band, an unknown band coming through town and changing things in our town, it was like the Sunday night before Christmas break. It was finals week in high school, and the unknown band Cap and Jazz from Chicago played a house show. And about 20 people were there. And I remember the flyer's actually on my wall somewhere, and it like gives directions. They're like, here's the plan: do homework all Saturday and Sunday, and then bring $1, and then come spend 2 hours at this show. And I was like, well, I did have finals, and it was Sunday, and I never heard of Cap and Jazz, so who knows what I did on that Sunday night. But then that Monday morning, all 20 of the people who were at the show, the only thing anyone could talk about was this band Cap and Jazz, and how they were so weird and uncategorizable, and yet seemed to be kind of possessed by this energy, and were coming from this very different place. And I think actually like watching the way in which that story became a myth within weeks of just young people spreading it around to each other was a really influential moment in terms of like reflecting on that and folding that into my writing of Fall Through. Was actually watching something like that happen in real time and recognizing that it's happening. We're like, something is happening and something is shifting right now. I don't know what it is. No one knows what it is. But when you're in the middle of something as it's happening, you often can't figure out why and how the pieces don't fit or where you're headed.
That's so interesting. And I feel like that I never got a chance to see your band Soophie Nun Squad, right? And as I've been reading about your band, and the tours that you guys went on, and how like the amorphous being that was your group, that the members are fluctuating show by show, blah 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 blah. It has that, like, it seems like your own band has that sort of like legacy to it, where like the people who experienced it were like, this thing was absolutely remarkable. The recordings will never do it justice, and they can never play live, or they can never play large shows because the intimacy of that won't function. So I'm kind of curious about Soophie Nun Squad. Um, the theme of your collaborations, I think, are something that we're going to come back to, uh, because I find it really interesting. But how how did you guys find your people for that? I mean, usually when somebody starts a band, you've got like 4 or 5 or 3 people who are just like, all right, we're gonna write songs, we're gonna do this thing. But your band had elements of puppetry that was thrown into it.
Yeah.
You had multiple lead singers that often fluctuated. Tell me a little bit about kind of that band, and then how it figured out that form, like the way in which that form would be ever changing.
Well, importantly, like Soophie Nun Squad was around for 14 years. So number one, we were actual children when we started. Like Mark, our drummer, who's in the metal band Pallbearer now, he was in elementary school when we played our first show. But we were very much like a band family who shaped each other growing up. But in that, we were also actually a family. Like there was a group of brothers, who were 2 of the 4 people of us who started the band. 2 band members, fell in love and got married along the way. There was another couple within the band at some point. And there were a lot of like amorphous, like auxiliary members who were also related very closely to the core band membership. But Soophie at the time, like when we started, this is where Little Rock was, again, deeply entwined in like the DC and Gilman Street influence. And this is sort of the transition moment between the second and third waves of what is poorly identified as like emo hardcore. I don't like using the E word, but so that we can discuss it, I'll use that.
It's a
So,
thing. It's a
yeah.
thing.
So like in that transition moment between those second and third waves, obviously like the elders, the 18-year-olds in the scene, were in these very powerful, very sincere bands that were pretty focused on being very serious about things all the time. And we were shaped by that. That's who we felt we were too. But as children, as ninth graders, accessing the what we also had on hand, we almost immediately brought this sense of it actually wasn't spectacle. It was sort of a sense of allowing it was either allowing ourselves to be involved in fundamentally uncool, embarrassing moments or situations as a way of combating, like just being beaten up for being a nerd or whatever, or it was like a refusal to be embarrassed by who you were and by yourself. And so that evolved into a concept over time that was like sort of like calling the bluff of like what people like to always describe in terms of like punk and performance. People being like, yeah, this band really, really like eroded the barrier between band and audience. And most of the time that's BS. So Soophie Nun Squad, I think fundamentally is calling that bluff. And it was like, if you want to see what it actually means to have there be no difference between the band and the audience, you have arrived in the same place. So a lot of it is when we played, we evolved into this concept that basically the band Diamond Mine uses in Fall Through. That's like, you're essentially consecrating a liberated space during this 25 minutes where the band is playing or whatever. We are here. This is something that will only happen once. You never step into the same river twice, but also it's like, okay, if you want this to happen, it will require the showgoers to augment and complete parts of certain songs. It requires some familiarity with these call and response parts. But also it's like urging people to get involved in things that seemed to be uncool, like that, like inventing dance moves that were vaguely embarrassing or humiliating, or really making fun of people trying to be too cool to be moved by music and by a moment. And that sort of developed its own kind of ecstatic, transcendent energy. And yeah, it is something like people are always like, so is there going to be a Soophie reunion on the horizon? And some of us are open to it. I've actually become more open to it lately. But typically, most of us are like vehemently opposed to a reunion show because it simply is incapable of approximating the very thing that made Soophie Nun Squad a unique, powerful experience.
You need to do something where it's like there's a show happening and then surprise guest. Like it needs to be something where people are
Yeah,
unsure
yeah.
that.
Actually, that's a good point. Your check is in the mail. That's a good suggestion. A fully unannounced, mundane, local Arkansas show with Soophie Nun Squad actually radically transforming the moment.
My
Yeah,
only request, Nate, is a quick Instagram message from you that just says, "It's
yeah,
time, Ryan. I'll be there.
yeah. Get your ticket.
I'll buy you a burrito."
Yeah.
Awesome. So the other thing I was curious about though is like, in any sort of, I don't know. Like one thing people hate talking about is the fact that like music has to always have some sort of business angle in order to function. Like there has to be a way for people to know that they are going to find some enjoyment in this experience. You can't normally just say like, come out on Tuesday at 6 o'clock at this venue. It'll be fun. No one believes you. You have to have something. And your association, from what I can pull, was like kind of like the Planet X Records, like folk punk scene, or seems to be kind of the people who kind of took you guys in. I know you toured with Ghost Mice. If I recall, is that a guitarist and a violin player?
Yes.
Right.
Sure.
They played Syracuse a number of times, and the Bike is a Pipe Bomb, Defiance, Ohio.
Yeah.
I was just curious about like, in regards to your shows, to have something that's just so chaotic and like, I don't know, Dance Dance Revolution-y about your band, and then all of a sudden having this like, these other bands that are just like, I don't know, extremely political, and they're singing folk punk songs and things like that. Like how did you get associated? How did you guys get associated with that community?
Well, that transition occurred really throughout the year 2000. I think I remember being aware that this Bike is a Pipe Bomb existed in 1997 when some of their roommates lived in my bathtub in New York City for a couple of months. That's where they slept. Uh, and But it wasn't really something that connected too much until I guess this Bike's a Pipe Bomb and the Devil is Electric played in Little Rock in the year 2000. Not only getting to make a personal connection, but also like especially coming off the heels of the late 1990s, sort of like taking the 90s do-it-yourself movement, and the Bay Area band Bread and Circuits in their LP insert has a written piece that really articulates this well. Something that's written in early 1999, talking about how like DIY has taken us a long time in 10 years, but it's time to recognize that we have to move into the next phase. We have to do it together. We've developed the resources, the network, a way of doing things, and we've grown together. So we don't have to limit ourselves by this not what is this now 90s framework of scrabbling things together. It's okay to expand and get more serious as we grow and find new ways to support each other, support our community, be a part of the world again. And that was very influential to me. And Soophie was touring with, like, we went on some short tours with Bread and Circuits and former members of Alphonsine. Yaphet Kotto was very influential personally and musically and stuff. But I think like a lot of it was also just like very loud, chaotic, emotional hardcore, like my favorite kind of music. But it was so refreshing to finally be exposed to this Bike as a Pipe Bomb and be exposed to their hearts as well as their sound. So really, like, I fell in love with the band Abe Froman from Michigan, just kind of a Comet Bus influenced pop punk band. And their 7-inch was just really saved me in a sad time as a 22-year-old. So I wrote them this love letter and sent them a record and a comic of mine. And Aaron from Abe Froman, to cut to the end of the story, who's now my my best friend and who lives here in Bloomington, called me back immediately, and we instantly forged this like excellent friendship. Went on tour together between Abe Froman and this Soophie side project band called Boom Fancy, and basically like lived off of wits and our luck. And from there, like then I moved into Abe Froman's house a few weeks later up in Michigan. And this was at this crucial period where what we refer to as the folk punk scene was actually really getting legs to stand up on. And I think like the only thing that sets it apart was, despite being kids who were often 3 or 4 years younger, just involved the sonic differences. And it was just a different age set of people who were figuring similar things out in a similar way. And it was refreshing at the time. It's always strange that Soophie is permanently associated with Planet X Records. I mean, they released several of our albums, but like, but you know, it's funny because like musically, we really have almost nothing in common with any of these bands. Like a lot of them are like very dear friends, and we've been on tours and adventures together. We've been roommates, but at the same time, yeah, it is really. I think what's funny is in that community, Soophie Nun Squad was sort of a refreshing outlier. That was, again, now we were the loud, all electric, chaotic, emotional band that was doing something that was happening in a different way from what the community at large was doing. And because we had so many band members, when you're getting into the practicalities of things working, it is funny that caused some tension. That like, okay, we have 10 band members, so we're going to be traveling, in these like 2 or 3 small vehicles like clown cars, getting where we're going, needing to take up so much more space and being still kind of oblivious to that. So like the whole folk punk scene and our association is kind of baffling and an outlier to me, but it's a very important part of Soophie's later journey.
Yeah, and I mean, in 14 years as a punk band is like, I mean that's multi-generational.
Yes.
I
Yeah,
mean,
and a punk era is really only like 2 years. So it's like 7 eras back to back.
yeah, you guys should get an award for that. So I want to talk one more thing about the punk scene and your organization just in general because I think it's fun. And that is like, you talk in other interviews about the idea that like part of what makes like punk operate is these like collective mindsets and these ability to develop systems that like are not official, at least on like on any sort of documented level, but it's official within the minds of the youth. And one of the things that you did is and you talk about it in Fall Through, like, is there's a culture of sneaking into people's swimming pools in the areas in Arkansas and where you grew up, right? That is, at least as far as I know, that was not a Syracuse thing. But I'm curious about like you guys developed an entire map of like all the pools and developed like a whole like swimming circuit. Like, is that true?
Yeah, we didn't have a physical map, but we basically had to like it's interesting that yes, it became sort of like a speakeasy informational share. Like, there was my crew, and it overlapped with a couple of other pool hopping crews. So like if we had a really safe space, there's this one way, way, way out on the fringes of West Little Rock that was so isolated that we could actually have 40 people go swim there quietly in the middle of the night, and it was fine. But there were these other spots where like if we like discovered a new apartment complex with a pool and a hot tub, then we would have like a small scouting party go jump the fence and see if we could turn on the hot tub and see how loud it was. And like if we got away with it, we would keep it under wraps for the summer so that we could enjoy it, and then we would bring it to everybody, be like, oh yeah, there's this new place. But what's funny is like it was always laced with this kind of Muppet style adventure. Like it's like this with anything with punk. The fact that all houses have names and stuff. The fact that it's almost like everything is a band. So like giving everything a code name became this it's like it was a celebratory act. was also a little bit of an exclusionary act, but it really protected the secrecy of what we were doing. So there's this one, like, I was actually just thinking about this one swimming pool when I was in Little Rock last week. There's this place we called Fern Gully. And somebody's like, oh, I found a swimming pool last night. It's in, like, Little Rock, Arkansas doesn't have a lot of tall buildings, but it was like, yeah, there's these weird high-rise apartments that I've never noticed before because they're built into the side of a hill, so you don't even notice that these are like 10-story buildings or whatever. And it's all covered in like kudzu and trees. And then way up in the middle of this complex is this hidden swimming pool and hot tub. And so somebody was like, yeah, this is like some Fern Gully nonsense. And it just became Fern Gully. But I was like driving past where I'm sure it was. Like, I know it was like within a quarter mile of this one little zone, but I'm like, I can't even there. If I spent an hour driving through this neighborhood trying to find Fern Gully, I don't think I could do it. And it's really amazing how, like, in the way that I talk about mythologizing and exclusion and all this stuff and fall through, seeing how it's still true. The fact that I buried the facts, the information from myself in the future. Like, there's just no way I can return to the site of this beloved secret swimming destination. We actually made it so secret that there's no way we could find it anymore.
That's fun. You need to hire a recon crew to go find
Yeah.
Ferngully. So I appreciate you indulging me in some punk and hardcore chat. And I have a feeling we'll get back to it when we talk about Fall Through. But I want to talk about like your start as a cartoonist. You as you mentioned, like at the time you're finding kind of the punk scene, you're also starting to publish, or you're starting to do your own comics, and you're starting to publish your own stuff to the extent where like you were also working on comics that with members of the band you started. But what I know you were highly influenced by the X-Men, and you were a huge beloved fan of X-Men comics. And it's not, when you were finding comics, it's not to the point where like now indie books are as common. Like, how did you find that sort of like fire inside yourself to be like, I have these stories that I really want to tell, and comics is the medium that I want to tell them in?
Well, early on, for maybe the first 4 years of self-publishing comics, really wasn't until I moved away from Arkansas for college that I became aware that comics narratives existed outside of, if not superheroes, then just like a basic power-based adventure format. So I had, like, I had a good amount of awareness of like comics that Dark Horse was releasing. And so, like, yeah, like things that Frank Miller and Jeff Darrow and stuff were doing registered with me. But the furthest outliers would be like, the original run of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was extremely important to me pre-punk. And even like opened the door into metal for me by like Metallica references within the comics in the 80s. But outside of that, and like Cerebus the Aardvark and stuff, like as I grew through high school and started having real feelings and questions and things I wanted to write and talk and draw about, I didn't really understand that comics could be an outlet for that. So I drifted away from reading comics in 11th grade. And one of the main reasons why was simply like it wasn't satisfying a fundamental, art need in me. And I'd already started self-publishing zines, with like bad poetry and, prose and rants and artwork galore. But it didn't occur to me that my zines and my comics could be one thing. What really kind of swayed me, so I started putting a lot of like what was satisfying my soul was going into my zines. And I think being exposed through a 1990s kind of like punk indie comics imprint called Migraine out of Portland, Oregon, that was a very big deal to me. Al Burion's comics, who's been in a million bands, his longest running band being Mile Marker, but also was a pretty prolific writer, zines and books. So there was a comic by him called The Long Walk Nowhere that came out in 97 that was very influential to me. And then like I Never Liked You by Chester Brown and Flood by Eric Drucker. These were the books that actually shattered my misconception of the limitations of comics in terms of subject matter and perspective and genre. And as soon as I was like, oh, these are the books that are nurturing my soul, the comics I make can be about anything. And this is something like, especially now, living in a post Blankets, post Persepolis, post Raina Telgemeier world, it seems like such a no-brainer. But again, it takes having that be pointed out to you, being illuminated, for you to actually like take it in and be like, oh, this is how it is. So really, finally, like as soon as I had that realization in 97 into 98, everything fell into place. And I got extremely serious about like allowing parts of, fictionalizing my personal life, or understanding that characters could come from punk, and understanding that these things could be folded into what I did, understanding that not everything had to revolve around superpowers or even conflict, understanding that like there's a place for my bad poetry, and that's in bad poetry comics. But yeah, I mean, it was a major revelation.
So at the same time, though, you're working with adults with disabilities, and you're advocating for those groups. And the comics thing is not financially sustainable for you, right? Like you can't quit your job and completely make all your money from your comics. And I'm just curious about like, I mean, you always say in your interviews, like, I had to tell the stories, like I have to make comics, it's required. What does that need feel like? Like, what is that? Like, what is that strain on your soul, my friend?
Well, you bet. Well, I mean, a lot of it is like, it's just that it's a fundamental, I think, like human creative hunger. Like I have found an outlet which satisfies that kind of yearning to be heard and to express what's important to me. But at the same time, like a lot of my classmates and friends who I went to school with at SVA in New York City, a lot of them, stayed behind over the summer or stayed in New York after school, got internships at Marvel or Nickelodeon, and really started putting out comics output very quickly. I mean, like a lot of still very influential, inspirational peers of mine, like Becky Cloonan, Farrell Dalrymple, the whole Meat House crew, James Jean, all these people. Raina was in my class, though we didn't know each other at all at the time. But because of the way my entire life was structured around punk and around what Soophie Nun Squad was doing, where we were traveling, it never even occurred to me that an option was to shift my focus and maybe to stay in one place and take advantage of some of the opportunities that I never even bothered to follow through on, because it was sort of taken as a given that I would work a job for 6 weeks, quit the job, and go on tour, and live in this kind of like haphazard way indefinitely. And so I feel like that was one of, like, when I talk about at the time how I had kind of given up from the late 90s all the way to like 2008. I'd given up on the possibility that I could even make a living doing comics. But a lot of it was because I wasn't even willing to entertain the possibility of changing some part of my life's structure in order to pursue that. And so it was easy to just kind of write it off. But once Soophie Nun Squad became defunct in 2006, that's really when it was after the fact that I realized that I had spent my entire adult life structuring everything I did around this entity that only existed a couple of times a year. And up until that point, I had never done a story longer than like 52 pages. And a lot of it was because I wasn't in one place for more than a few months. And so suddenly, this book that became Swallow Me Whole, I'd been working on it slowly for a couple of years, quietly. But now, all of a sudden, in 2006 and 2007, I realized there's really no difference between a 50-page story and a 200-page story. It just requires sitting in one place and being able to prioritize it for long enough to make it happen. And that was really like, in terms of how we choose to spend our time and how we choose to think of it, the fact that Soophie Nun Squad like lived out its lifespan and was done maybe a few years after it needed to be done, that was what actually cleared the way for me to begin catching up with my life. And so once that book came out, I was still kind of alien from comics as a community and a culture and an industry. So it never occurred to me that people would actually read it, or that people could respond to it, or that opportunities would open up as a result. And so it took a while to acclimate, to be like, oh, somebody's getting in touch with me about doing another book. To be like, well, I don't know about all that. And then realizing like, this is what I've been waiting for forever. Why don't I just take a chance and see for once if it can work out for a few months or a year or whatever?
Well, speaking of getting those phone calls, a lot of anybody who goes to a library or is going to a place where it's like, hey, what is the book that you need to read that is going to change your perspective on things? A lot of people think the March series is that book, that series, right? So you worked with Congressman John Lewis and his have the title here, but his
His staffer.
his staff, digital director and policy advisor,
Yes.
Andrew Ayden. And you're selected to do this book. And what I'm curious about before we even start to talk about the process of March, but like you have a very unique illustration style and a very unique method of doing panel layouts and whatnot. I'm curious about like as you stepped into that project, how did they know like what type of art style they were? I mean, I'm assuming they knew what kind of art style they were getting, but like, what do you think it is about your sort of like unique voice as an illustrator that really made them feel like you were the fit for that project?
Let's see. Well, Andrew was familiar with Swallow Me Whole and Any Empire, but I thank Chris Staros, publisher of Top Shelf, for being the person who like John Lewis and Andrew, worked up a rough version of the script together for a few years before I came on board, got a deal with Top Shelf with no artist. And I've been working with Top Shelf for several years already. And, we had built a great relationship. So Chris Staros called me in the middle of one day. I'd actually read the press release about March. I was like on a lunch break and I was like, oh, what a cool book idea. March, young people at the center of the civil rights movement. Awesome. And I didn't put two and two together that like the lack of an artist listed meant there was no artist yet. But I was like, well, back to work. And a couple of weeks later, Chris Staros called me. That was like, Nate, just making sure you saw the news about March. And basically he's like, they're looking for an artist. And I want you to know that like, I highly recommended that they have you submit work to see if you guys would be a good fit. And Chris Staros's reasoning, which I'm very thankful for him like advocating, was number one, you're from the South. You already have this like topographical, cultural, detail-oriented set of memories and experiences like of my own. And because so much of my books of all kinds have to do about sense memory and how we process memory and forgetting, that like they're on a narrative level, there's an extra layer that works very well with the memoir portion of March, which allows me to kind of move into young John Lewis's perspective in an intimate way, but with some familiarity coming off of my own memories of growing up in the South. And another part was stylistically, the fact that I had enough of a finish and enough of a like realistic representational mode of cartooning that I could kind of hit the nail on the head, hopefully, and be able to tackle hundreds of recognizable historical figures, and etc. But with a lot of like my focus page to page and panel to panel, I'm so much more interested in the subjective experiences of the characters depicted, in catching like this sort of like intangible subjective quality that essentially that's what would hopefully prevent March from being a more dry nonfiction historical narrative. Particularly the fact that it is history and it is objective, but it is from the subjective experiences of one person, the storyteller at the center of it. And so much of it is focused on what he saw, what he heard, what he felt. and being able to get as close to that as possible. So I feel like being able to combine those two things, Chris Staros felt would really set the book up for success as far as actually being able to tell the story in a unique and powerful way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's very few comics and that I feel like I can't force myself to just plow through. Like it's your work in particular, and especially your work in March, and just the way in which those narratives are structured is I feel like I get 10 pages in and I just have to like sit there and check my privilege for a little bit and then do the next thing and then do the next thing. And it clearly had an impact. I mean, you guys, you win the National Book Award for that. You're nominated for a number of, Eisner Awards for it. It's a series that is, I mean, it's just absolutely remarkable. I guess what I'm like, one thing I'm curious about is like, when you signed up for that, I mean, as somebody who has felt so empowered and excited to tell his own stories and had done work in adaptation before, but now you're going to be doing hundreds and hundreds of pages of somebody else's narrative. Like, how did you kind of like mentally set yourself up for that? And how did it feel being entrusted with that story?
Well, I'd say like immediately, like this is where my work, which immediately preceded March, both books, Any Empire and The Silence of Our Friends, really set me on a path so that I was already thinking about how to approach March in terms of problem solving, but also in terms of vision. And I was really ready to hit the ground running. So, even or maybe even especially with my fiction, a lot of the same like social and political concerns are wrapped up in the books. They're just sort of focused through a little more like personal and interpersonal dynamic or lens. But I feel like, on a practical level, doing The Silence of Our Friends, which is a barely fictionalized period piece that takes place in the Houston area against the backdrop of a forgotten chapter of civil rights movement history. It was my first time to use my gray wash style. And the reason I chose that is actually because I was drawing Any Empire at the same time. Like I would do Any Empire during the mornings, Silence during the afternoons. And I simply wanted to be able to break that up mentally so it'd be less boring and grueling. And I fell in love with gray washes. And then I began to see the value for those of us born after 1970 or whatever. Our understanding of 20th century, American events and history is largely in black and white because of grainy video footage and black and white photography. So instead of like trying to bring it to life in bold color or trying to pick a different way that would shy away from the impact of black and white photography, I was like, okay, this is a common reference point. This works. And I can tell because it's working for me already. I just kind of like embraced the fact that it was helping everyone be able to bridge the disconnect of decades or whatever. Like I was just like, there were certainly like, there was anxiety very early on about, like, am I going to tell this job, I'm going to do this in the right way? Or will there be like a lot of pushback or whatever? What's the deal going to be? But this is where like regularly, not only would John Lewis go to bat for me, but it was the fact that I would have to remind myself early on before I had kind of like established what I was doing. Like John Lewis himself chose me to tell his story through his eyes and in his words. And a lot of the anxiety going into it, I recognized was actually just more or less like, just like kind of a peak whiteness exercise of like, again, I was making it all about me by being anxious about what I was bringing to the table when what was important to center myself on was not, it was like basically being open to a little bit of skepticism, being open to criticism, and being able to push back against that and establish myself with the work I was putting in. And as soon as I recognized that it's pretty easy to make it not all about you, and that's by and that's by working your booty off on the page, and a lot of that dissipated so quickly. Like once the first book was published, it functioned as a proof of concept, and we also kind of learned to work together over that first book. So then starting with book two, like we were off running, like writing and drawing to each other's strengths. We finally knew what we were doing, and we were increasingly making the book, or realizing the book was more about our present moment than it was about the civil rights movement era itself.
It's fascinating. One thing I'm not sure if this is the right question, but I'm kind of curious about it anyway. I mean, so you have John Lewis going to bat for you, which is like, I'm not sure there's a cooler person to have,
Yeah, no
in the
joke.
back corner with his arms crossed, being like, trust Nate. I mean, that's awesome. And then Andrew Ayden, who I have been researching over the last few weeks, like, brilliant academic who has focused so much time on the civil rights movement and understanding publications that have come out that we kind of ignored that were really influential. But he's also somebody who is hired because he's a part of the political machine. And I don't mean to belittle his role, but like, he was making sure that every piece of digital communication that comes out about John Lewis is on brand and follows the production Bible of his politics and whatnot. When you guys were working on March, were there any moments at which you had to sort of like adapt and adjust based off of the I don't know, the imaging and the approaches that needed to happen with like the brand of John Lewis?
Well, what's interesting about that, I appreciate your framing of this in setting up this question. But what's important to note, and it's easy to forget this now, just in 2024, but like prior to the release of March Book One, there was this period of maybe even more than a decade where there was a lot of context lost about John Lewis and who he was. Like I knew his name, but I couldn't tell you what he had done before I started reading about SNCC and reading Walking with the Wind, etc. And so like Andrew, one of Andrew's many hats he wore was he was a professional tweeter. As digital director for Congressman Lewis, he's the professional tweeter. He invented the hashtag good trouble, and so a lot of it was like his recognition that people within his own district, especially younger people, were sort of like missing this larger historical context, and that John Lewis was at the center of so much of it. And so like John Lewis was his congressman since he was 3 years old in his district, and he grew up in Atlanta public schools and never heard a single thing about SNCC or about John Lewis or about the young people of the movement, not a single thing. And so there was this very personal kind of like vindication and redemption, historical redemption, that was significant to Andrew. And I was oblivious to a lot of that because I was also oblivious to the impact of SNCC and of John Lewis and Diane Nash and all of these young activists and leaders. And so along the way, like oftentimes, I wasn't really very involved with having a social media presence. By the time like I was working on that first book, I had a Facebook account, but I didn't get one until 2010. And I didn't have a Twitter account till like late 2013. I think it was like the first time we went on the Rachel Maddow show. Andrew and our editor Lee were like, dude, you need to get a Twitter account. And I'm like, why? And they're like, he doesn't understand. And I'm like, okay. And a lot of it was just like acclimating to, at the time, what was compared to now, a much more democratized sort of public sphere with social media, but also like in real time, recognizing and seeing the ways in which there was this massive power struggle happening between the future of multiracial democracy and the encroaching of like corporate controlled authoritarian rule. And so in retrospect, you can see how like in those mid 2010s, while these March books were coming out, being like, oh, reading about Cambridge Analytica and reading about, like far right intelligence and counterintelligence tanks doing psyops on the American people on Facebook, and then recognizing like, oh, there's Russian misinformation and propaganda that I engaged with. Oh, that's a Cambridge Analytica project that I definitely helped fan the flames of by misapplying and misunderstanding the social rules of engagement on social media. And so, like, a lot of it was just a struggle to acclimate to because it seemed so extraneous to what I was doing on the page. But it became increasingly important to establish and develop my own independent voice on these things I was still choosing to be involved with. However, like, this is the kind of baggage a lot of people haven't unpacked, was like, how much Russian propaganda did you get sucked into, without being aware? How many of Cambridge Analytica's projects were you engaging with because that was part of the unannounced aim of the project, was to sort of like tilt exposure to heightened emotions, to violence, to autoplay video feeds, etc. in 2014 to 2016. It's just real harrowing stuff, and like a lot of it really just sucked a lot of time away from, like this. It was like multiple full-time jobs at once.
I'm sure. And it's interesting, you alluded to it a little bit, but the idea that like the March books were kind of the rebranding of John Lewis is like an interesting angle to consider,
Yeah,
that
I mean, and like, obviously, like, that's accurate. It's not the best choice of words, but that's what it is. And a lot of it simply has to do with reestablishing, not only reestablishing what his own contributions were to the civil rights movement, and to, like, it's also easy to forget that just a few weeks before March Book One came out, the Supreme Court gutted the key provision of the Voting Rights Act, which John Lewis and hundreds of other activists and organizers pushed into existence in 1965. And so for John Lewis, in real time, these were enormous consequences that were directly playing into what we were, the exact history we were trying to reintroduce, recontextualize, and revitalize. It was just like, it was a really intense period in which, like, probably one of the greatest things I'll ever do in my life is being a part of something which has measurably in some way shifted culture in a positive direction, though in response to these harrowing anti-democracy forces. But it was really wild just to be on the fringes of something in the middle of American culture and history, as we were having this enormous shift, this huge collective shift, this push and pull. And it's really wild to make something that was, about our past, but was clearly, like, had as much or more value in noting the shift that was happening in American culture year by year, month by month.
Yeah, I mean, it came out just it's a right time, right place kind of book,
For sure.
So we could talk about March all day. For listeners out there who are unfamiliar, go get the books. You need to read them. They're amazing. And there's also there's a great YouTube video of you guys talking at University of Michigan, where
Oh yeah.
the three of you kind of independently tell your stories, and then take questions from the audience, and it truly recontextualizes that entire project in a manner that I think is beneficial. But you've got two new books out. You got a new book out called Fall Through, and then Lies My Teacher Told Me, the adaptation, is coming out on April 16th. And I'd love to talk about Fall Through to kind of make our way back to punk and hardcore.
Oh yeah.
You've got a book that I just adore, and another beautiful dense piece of material that I need to reread 6 times before I can truly absorb it. But what kind of put you on the track to write Fall Through? It follows the band Diamond Mind, which you had in a previous book. Sorry, what's that? Come Again? Is that the book?
Come Again. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Previous and Come Again. Tell us about the sort of the gestation of Fall Through.
This is where, like, comics take a long time to make, but 80% of that work is before you even get, a page out to start drawing. Like 80% of the work is just the slowly gestating writing, characterization, and how those tie in with your themes, and whether or not it's even possible to make a book that expresses the thing you're trying to express. The earliest seeds of this of fall through were planted even like in 2007. I just kind of wanted to write this zine that was reflections on traveling so much with a band and growing up together and realizing where you kind of like fell short of being there for your friends because you were so sucked into this kind of like quantum experience living in this bubble together where you have these collectively shared experiences, but not recognizing how that's pulling away from other very important things happening to everyone's lives out in the world. Nothing ever happened from it. So I just let that sit for a while. And then, yeah, when I was writing them again while drawing March, I basically had this one scene where, unrelated to anything else, I was like, I want to come up with Arkansas's fictional first punk band. And this is a story that took place in 1979. And basically, like, it was a tribute to a local band with some of my best friends, this band Fat Shadow from here in Bloomington. So I originally just patterned them off of that. They played a Fat Shadow song in the book, but I had so much fun drawing these 10 pages that when they drove off into the sunset at the end of that scene, I was like, oh, that can't be it. And I was like, I have to know more about these characters because they're not even characters yet. They're just my friends, and so eventually I recognized that a lot of my reflections about being in Soophie Nun Squad, about traveling, about punk, etc., could find a better home in fiction. That, like, the real role of fiction is to expose the truth about our world that we all share, and originally I wanted to do a book that was basically just Diamond Mine eating, sleeping, and driving together, forever on tour with not even a single note of music. And I was like, the music is a distraction because people will be like, this is a rock and roll book, tell us about the music. And so initially I was like, yeah, they're like set up, they're all plugged in. And like the second before they even play a note, it's a smash cut and they're in a new scene, maybe a different year somewhere else. And I wanted it to be kind of disorienting, but give this picture of what the entire experience of being in a band family was like. So basically, at a certain point, I was like, that probably wouldn't be as cool as I'm thinking it would be. So instead of taking the shows away from the reader, I decided to take the band away from their own shows, which is structurally, that's what happens in the plot of Fall Through. No spoilers. But that's basically, that decision was what started the problem solving process of writing, where I was like, okay, well, how do I yank a band away from their own shows? What does that mean? And since I do kind of like weird, magical, realist fiction, I'm like, okay, so I should just start by accepting that I'm going to yank them away from their own shows. And so either there is like some sort of like cosmic quantum physics solution, there's a magical solution. There are already like curses and demons in my books and stuff, and weird wormholes. So a lot of it was figuring out exactly how that would make sense and sort of reverse engineering components that would bring me to that point, which is really where the fun of writing begins. Is like, as I'm growing to learn who the characters are and what they mean to each other, really just like knowing certain things I want to be in the book and figuring out the steps along the way, which will allow me to draw those moments.
Yeah, and in the book you've got like I know you're a big Lind Ward like wood carving fan, arguably like the creator of the first kind of graphic novel before the invention of the comic book.
Yeah.
That makes it in there. Your tour stories about some people deciding to sleep outside, or who's going to sleep in the van, or
Yeah.
that sort of dynamic. And then one of the things that you have in there that I just absolutely adore is the fabrication process of making your merch and making things. And like there's very few pieces of media that I feel do a great job of demonstrating punk culture. Like the film Green Room is one that I think does like an interesting job of talking about like a band on tour. But as I was reading that, like all of a sudden my brain was just like flashing back And just getting so excited about like, oh my God, like remember the time when I would just get excited to make stencils and spray paint things or do whatever.
Yes.
And that like love letter to that sort of fabrication process really just spoke to me in that book. I thought it was great.
Well, thank you. And also that really, again, that's something that I think I take for granted as being something that people are generally aware of in terms of what do it yourself means. And a lot of it is like, yes, you're a teenager with relatively limited resources. So along the way, you're like seeing what other young people are doing and then also kind of reverse engineering how to get similar effects or how your style is influenced by your limitations of like what you have around. And so, yeah, a lot of it just simply folds into being like, oh, I can go to the art supply store and these stamps are $1 a piece. Or I can go dumpster dive behind the bookstore and get all these magazines and like thrown out reference books and materials, and recognizing that all of these are raw materials. And uh, Lee Walton, my longtime editor and friend, he put it, these are his words, but recognizing that, like, as a young person, you don't have much money and you don't have resources in that way, but you're a billionaire in minutes. And like you can sit down with 2 or 3 of your friends and spend like 40 hours meticulously screen printing and stenciling and folding and stapling, all for the price of like soda and Little Debbie snacks or something. And it's a not only like the privilege of having that time, but the enthusiasm for spending that time together to make something that actually allows DIY aesthetic to thrive in whatever stylistic manifestation it does emerge.
Oh, it's amazing. Next time my students are complaining about time, I'll let them know that they are billionaires in minutes.
That
Uh,
it's the best way to put it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also think that like one of the energies that you capture in this is the idea that like we need to have faith in the youth to problem solve. And I think that that's one of the things that like punk and hardcore, when done right and when focused on the right elements, really does a great job of encapsulating. And in that same vein, a lot of the book is built around the recording of a 7-inch record. And anybody who comes from the punk and hardcore space, like 7 inches are like gold. They are the greatest invention in vinyl history.
It's the
You know,
touchstone.
absolutely. And there's just this amazing sequence of like talking about how we're going to use this company's return policy to get this piece of equipment and we're going to plug all these things in to make this work, and then the way in which one person can alter that entire dynamic and you have to make a choice as to whether or not you're going to embrace that change or you're going to move forward. But I feel like that theme of like the energy of youth, and even if you're not making the right decisions in your 20s, that the energy you're putting into the universe is valued. I feel like it's just a nice love letter to that.
Thank you. And I agree. A lot of it is like, I still go to shows. I'm still involved with my community here in town, but largely it's like, yeah, if my best friend plays, who's also a parent, when she's able to get out of the house and play, in one of her 4 bands or whatever, those are the only times I go to shows. And so like recognizing that, yes, now I'm the weird middle-aged guy who's still the only person in my scene who takes pictures of bands. But like, it's that awareness of being like, well, I may actually just be the weird old guy with a camera now. But it's important to recognize that like it's okay that life has taken a different direction and that I love the direction that life has taken, while recognizing, yes, like this being an avenue to actually write a love letter to the things which continue to pull me back into the underground, even though like not only her face is different, not only is aesthetic different, but underground music has thankfully evolved like organizationally, structurally, culturally for a very different world. And so it's also nice that it's nice to talk about. It's easy for me to forget that there has been this generational shift by which, like it was possible before Hurricane Katrina to drive around with gas that was like under $1.50 pre-Katrina, but under $1 in the 1990s. So like, yes, you could actually go on an entire tour and never play in a venue with a stage even one time, just have a hat passed around. And as long as you got about $15 a day, you could fill up your gas tank and make it to the next place. That was all that was required. And you know, it's interesting to see bands be able to survive and thrive now, and have networks survive and thrive by abandoning some of those outmoded expectations of like what is now a 40-something-year-old cliche of a $5 cover charge. You know, like where a $5 show in 1981 would be like a $16 show now. And so I always try to keep that in mind, like, you know, like having friends, bands either get back together or find new ways post-pandemic of touring to be like, okay, you know, we're an East Coast band. We're going to go play for a week on the West Coast. We're going to borrow some equipment. We're going to fly there. The shows will be $30, but then have people be like, for $30, I can go see you and you'll get out here. Let's do it. I'll see you there. And that is what fills me with so much hope, is having people become older people through underground music and recognize that this is participatory. And part of that means like letting go of some of the obsolete baggage and being like, it's meaningful to go spend $30 to see your friends so that they're able to continue doing this thing. It's still an implicit contract amongst everyone who shows up to help keep things alive and thriving.
Awesome. Well, I want to be mindful of your time, Nate. I got a couple, one more question about Fall Through. I want to talk about your new book, and then you'll go work at your drafting table and make amazing things.
Indeed.
But one of the things that I'm curious about is, you know, we alluded to straight edge before, and I'll just be upfront and say that like I'm a non-gang minded, non-violent straight edge dude. And for those who are listening at home who have no idea what straight edge is, it was you know, I guess some would argue a social movement, anti-drugs, anti-alcohol. I don't drink or do drugs. I have no interest in it. But there's been a variety of different types of straight edge movements, to the extent where, you know, the FBI has files on different straight edge movements that were associated with specific violence. There's, you know, different sort of gang mentalities. I remember when I was like growing up in the community, people would wear t-shirts that would say like, kill your local drug dealer, and stuff like that. In Fall Through, there's a band from Connecticut, and I'm not trying to dig into dirt on this. That's not where I'm headed at all.
Under Hunch.
Yeah, was that the band?
Oh, I mean they're fictional, but yes.
Yeah.
Under Hunch.
Under Hunch. But I'm curious about like your associations with the straight edge movement, and you know, why that specific type of more kind of like bro gang minded, you know, like aggressive, my beliefs are my beliefs forever, but I'm going to be doing cocaine in 10 years kind of like mentality, like why that was the angle that straight edge made it into your book. Like I just, everybody in different parts of the world has completely different belief systems and understanding of this movement. I'm just super curious about the Nate Powell version.
You bet. To quickly do the end of that and then go back to answer the full thing. In a nutshell, as far as how it fits into the themes of the book, I think a lot of this book and the prequel book that I'm doing simply has to do with the traps of rigid thinking and like boxing yourself into ideological traps that don't allow you to change, to grow, but also to admit your vulnerability or see the world as it is. So I was straight edge by default until I was like 24. And so when I got into punk, there was a small straight edge crew with one straight edge band in Little Rock. The band was called Entrance. Basically like being nestled between Memphis, who had already by the early 90s had like a Memphis hardline straight edge crew that were known as being much more intimidating and somewhat violent. And then Fort Smith, Arkansas, which had like transitioned more into like grindcore and power violence and stuff, but definitely had a stronger, more dogmatic and more dichotomous extremes within their scene, including a stronger kind of like straight edge scene. But for me as a young nerd, like where pre-punk, I wasn't interested in drinking or smoking or anything. Like I was a nerd, and so I was intimidated by it. but already like I already kind of knew what I was doing and what I was interested in. And I simply wasn't interested as like a seventh grader, an eighth grader, into the windows that were being opened by like other junior high kids drinking and smoking and stuff. So when I got into punk, and like most of my close friends who then became Soophie Nun Squad, we were already straight edge by default. And so none of us were like, we had our own thing going on, but then we realized that straight edge was a thing. We were like, oh, okay, this has a precedent, you know. And I think in high school there is it like I X'd up probably into almost 11th grade, but a lot of it is like in Arkansas we didn't have really, we had like two hardline kids, and there wasn't any violence or thuggish behavior. A lot of it was just like ideological inflexibility and posturing. But as a high schooler, I think there was a value, like a rebellious value, in identifying yourself as being like, I don't want any part of your world. To be like to the other kids at my school, I've got my own thing going on. I don't even drink or smoke. I'm not interested in doing acid with you. But at the same time, you know, I was skating and hanging out and going to parties and shows with all kinds of people doing all kinds of drugs. And that includes this is the early 90s. So crossing over with like friend groups who were then becoming like gun dealers and were becoming actual gang members. Like we were protected by, at my school, we were protected by the Crips against other gangs because the Crips kind of thought we were like silly white boys and kind of took a liking to us, and we would hang out together all the time, like before school. But other friends were getting involved with other gangs throughout Little Rock and getting involved in crazier and crazier stuff. So yeah, in general, like once I had my own thing going and I didn't identify as straight edge in that kind of branded way, it still really fit for me until at some point I had a White Russian and I was like, oh, this is delicious. And I'm like, oh, okay. But yeah, so like for me, having this like hardline straight edge band from Connecticut that's clearly awash in like upper middle class disposable income from their parents or whatever, to me in the 90s in particular, and it's funny discussing this with you because you're talking, the first thing you said, we are like, yeah, growing up in Syracuse. And I was like, oh boy, you've got some stories. Like when I went to school in DC in 96, before I went to New York City, that was my first exposure of this kind of like corporate, conservative, capitalist, straight edge hardcore, where I'm like, oh, you guys are really all about your pants and your shoes and your hoodies and the things you buy and having identity politics, branding yourself through what you consume. And I was like, what is this? And so, to me, it's a very 90s thing. Like the fact that that kind of consumerist straight edge existed after the 90s is wild to me, because it seems like so much of underground hardcore punk is not only a reaction against, but in this dynamic tension with that kind of conservative capitalist mindset that a lot of those corporate straight edge bands exhibit. And so for me, having Underhunch in this band or in this book was a great, like, I mean, you know, like Diamond Mine is a pretty queer, multiracial, half woman composed band that's also like a misfit among misfits. They're an Arkansas band. They have an indescribable aesthetic. And so, yeah, like when you tour in the underground, you get set on shows with these very strange lineups of people sometimes. And so it was not uncommon at all to wind up with an Underhunch who basically exhibit nothing but like lousy misogynist jokes, like, you know, it's funny to talk about the different rules and dynamics in different pockets of punk, but coming from like Diamond Mine, coming from a pocket of punk where you're not even supposed to mention that you have a record. Like you're not supposed to make any money off of your shirts. They shouldn't be more than $3, $3. But the other extreme is basically making your band's show be a commercial for your products. and recognizing that like a lot of the inherent contradictions for a band like Underhunch as a part of the community, we can see 20 or 30 years later as being like, this is a kind of like very secure white man adventure that clearly opened itself up in the 2010s to a lot of like hard libertarian, conspiratorial minded, anti-democracy thinking. So yes, like there's a punchline at the end of it where they're watching Underhunch play, and the singer has a shirt that just says "Purity" with two X's, and obviously that should be the name of the band, Purity. But like one of the band members mentions, be like, Money says that in 20 years, 2 of these band members will be Nazis and 2 will be alcoholics. And another band member's like, "Are you for real?" And then I have the voiceover caption just say, "They were." And this was my lived experience, like into my 30s and into my 40s, being like, "I wonder what happened to that member of that hardcore band." Oh, just knowing that it happens, and like that ideological rigidity has a lot of people fall back into their comfort zone, or for a lot of people, straight edge was a defense mechanism against abuse, misuse, excess. And like it did serve an important function that sometimes when that collapsed, like it was a guard against intergenerational addiction issues and abuse issues in their homes. So like, like it's a zinger, but I don't mean it in a totally dismissive, dehumanizing way in the book.
Yeah, to be clear, reading it, I viewed it as tongue in cheek. I wasn't like
Yeah.
reading it and being like, "How dare Nate Powell make
Oh,
fun of
sure.
my people for not drinking alcohol?" But it's it's an interesting thing just because like when you're tackling a book that's dealing with the nuance upon the nuance upon the nuance of any sort of punk community, you can't talk about anything without either missing a component, I quotes there, please, or talking about something that's so hyper personal to your own experience with this one little thing. That's great. What just quick follow up to that, and I'm gonna just acknowledge the irony of this comment is that I had a moment a few months ago where I was listening to a band that I really liked in the, I don't know, 2008, something like that, and I was like. Their singer was a guitarist in a bunch of other bands, and I was like, I wonder what happened to that guy. And now he owns a business consulting company and does like an empowerment podcast. And I was like, that is the 2008 version of looking down the barrel,
Yes.
you know. And it is funny to see I don't know, these sort of like people who are just so embedded or believe they're so embedded in their punk and hardcore life, and then once they actually take a step back and realize who they are, there's there's a finite number of avenues they tend to go into, which I
For
think is
sure.
pretty fun. So let's talk about your most recent book. So you've got Lies My Teacher Told Me coming out on April 16th, which is an adaptation of is it James W. Loewen? Is that how you say the name?
Yeah, I think it's Loewen.
Loewen.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I'm not
So
sure. Actually, I'm not sure though. Good point.
Nate Powell, Ryan Zlomek need to do some research.
Yeah.
So tell me about this project. You're back to doing adaptation. You're kind of taking a step back away from your hyper personal stories, and now you're focusing on history, and you're focusing on recontextualizing history that we don't often acknowledge. Interesting. It's like you've done that before, Nate. So
Indeed.
tell us about this amazing book and sort of what you've been doing.
You bet. Well, okay. So, Lies My Teacher Told Me was originally published in its all text form in 1995, and I read it in the maybe around 2005. It was a very, very influential book for me, as was James Loewen's subsequent work, Sundown Towns: A Hidden Dimension of American Racism. Um, Essentially, this is a history book about American history textbooks. So some of it is simply about like crucial moments of American history, which are commonly and regularly mistaught and are kind of mixed up with nationalist myth or longstanding misconceptions. And it sort of outlines and clears those up. But the other major thread through the book is how and why on earth this is able to even happen, and even how it's able to be such a long-standing problem. So it sort of pulls back the curtain into the fact that very few people are actually at the helm in terms of writing, fact checking, editing components of American history textbooks. And this is how you wind up with information, with misinformation from the 1880s that is somehow still in books today, et cetera. And it actually goes through some of those shifts over the last century, in which, like, for example, when teaching about John Brown, it moves through like decade by decade, lining up the eras in which John Brown was considered in history textbooks to be totally sane, or whether he was considered to be a madman, and like how that lines up with the history of Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, and the nadir of American race relations, the civil rights movement, and recognizing that there is purpose. Not only is there purpose sometimes to leaning into these incorrect myths and misconceptions about history, but recognizing that they benefit particular parties at times. And a lot of it is also simply about like the dangers of heroification. Like, these are issues which really aren't partisan issues, but it's like by we being afraid of not knowing and being like, I don't know the answer to that, or being afraid of addressing something which may be seen as controversial, or historical information which is contested and is unclear. A lot of it is like little decisions along the way that result in choosing the path of least resistance in terms of whatever information might find its way into a history book, and the ways in which we've kind of internalized all that. And it's changed our concept, not only of American history, but of what's possible in our society, in our democracy, and in the future of the nation. But a lot of it is like a testament to young people, like being able to pick up on all of that already, and recognizing that, like if as a young person you thought history class was boring, that there are reasons why it's unsatisfying and boring and confusing. And because these books are kind of written in a way that isn't nearly as interesting and strange as American history actually is.
That's awesome. How, I mean, the irony is that you've got this massive text all about how history has been, altered or misconstrued or poorly communicated, and then you have to synthesize that down to a graphic novel medium. What was that process like?
Well, so he wrote me a month before the world shut down in early 2020, out of the blue, just seeing if I was interested in adapting this book. And I was like, oh, well, yes, like we'll work out the details later, but I'm ready to go now. Let's do this. I was so excited to do this project. So the whole, like all of 2020, my younger kid was entering kindergarten on an iPad at home, on the couch. And so I spent that kindergarten year rereading and rereading Lies My Teacher Told Me, kind of underlining, crossing out, sort of breaking it down into a more digestible size, and then thumbnailing it based on that. And so a lot of it is actually in the margins of a physical copy of the original book, but also recognizing the limitations. Like I knew that this book had to be less than 300 pages or it would just be too much. So realizing that about half of the textual information would need to be left out of the finished version. So kind of seeing the larger narratives and directions that each chapter of the book was taking, and trying to recognize what was essential information for conveying what James Loewen was trying to convey in that chapter, or in that historical slice, that historical example, and allowing, like, sort of conceiving of the comics edition as being an indispensable companion to the original text. So there's always going to be like all these footnotes, all the sourcing, but also deeper and broader historical information in the original text. They're meant to be used together. So it was really interesting. Like it was such like an intensive application of being concrete and using all my skills of clarity, but also recognizing that James Loewen has this kind of like very funny, irreverent way of speaking and writing about it. It's very refreshing. Um, and trying to, I never got a chance to meet him in person. We would talk on the phone and email and stuff, but trying to get a sense of self, of his self out on the page, especially like he passed away in 2021. So I had to kind of take this across the finish line. And part of that was trying to like get that sense of who he was and that sense of why he personally really felt so strongly about this topic, and try to convey that as well as convey his own humanity as the narrator of this history book.
That's amazing. I'll be completely honest with you. Before we started talking, I was a little unsure whether I was going to buy it, and I am so excited to read that now.
It's a good read. It's
Yeah, it is, and I'm like the fact that you were chosen for it. I mean, you've just got this great theme in your career of people who are like, Nate Powell is the person who can communicate this effectively. Like, I'm not sure there's a greater, a greater just tap on the shoulder and high five than that as a cartoonist, right?
it feels wonderful, especially because a lot of my solo fiction is pretty far out there and is so intuitive that it kind of helps gird me for that, recognizing like, oh, I can make sense in my books. People seek me out because what I do makes sense. I need to take that and apply it to my weird fiction and recognize that it's all one thing.
Yeah, to go from magical realism to like clarity it's a difficult skill. Kudos to you, Nate. You're great.
Doing what I can.
So last two things real quick is Nate, how do people find you? Like
Oh
how
yeah,
do people learn about the Nate Powell and all the cool things that are going on?
sure. Well, my website is just either nate-powell.com, or what it actually redirects to is seemybrotherdance.org. Like, it was the thing where 20 years ago I got a domain and I was like, oh yeah, .org, that's going to be for me. And now here I am. Or I'm on Instagram and my handle is seemybrotherdance. And I don't really have a lot of faith in the remaining social media platforms. So I do exist on them, but they're really not of consequence. So I would go to just my website is a good starter spot, or on Instagram. I'm fairly active on that.
What is the origin of See My Brother Dance?
It was actually a Soophie Nun Squad show in 2000 where basically we had just recorded a song at somebody's house on an 8-track that was really weird, and we're like, yes, that was so fun. Let's keep the party going. Be like, let's decide to do a benefit show for Food Not Bombs tomorrow night. We'll do it at midnight at a 24-hour laundromat, and we'll have people come and bring clothes to wash and donate, but also the donation will be quarters to run the washing machines, which will legally justify our being there. And we'll play an acoustic show, so we won't be disrupting the sound, using electricity, all this stuff. We try to like really get around it. We're like, let's stay up all night and make a zine explaining our intentions and explaining Food Not Bombs. And then once we were working on the zine, we start making flyers for the next night. So we make 5 different flyers for this one show. I don't know, like, we were just like drinking a lot of Mountain Dew and just going for it. And Tim from Soophie Nun Squad was making a bunch of the flyers, and he just started making up multiple bands, just making up bands out of nothing. As filling this bill. It was just a Soophie Nun Squad show. But one of the random bands was just called See My Brother Dance. And then I had just recorded this kind of like Casio roller skate pop song on a 4-track a few weeks prior. And Tim was like, I think that's the name of your solo band. You're See My Brother Dance. And I was like, you're right. And so then I decided I'm going to bring the Casio SK5 and I'm going to actually play the song, which I did. And then now 24 years later, I'm stuck with See My Brother Dance.
I'm so glad I asked that question. So you've once again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this conversation. Is there anything that we haven't covered, anything on your mind that you want to kind of get out there before we depart?
No, I'm feeling good.
Awesome. That's what we like. Nate, this has been a tremendous honor. Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Nate Powell. Again, I want to thank him for taking so much time to have such a thoughtful conversation and cover such a variety of topics. Again, if you have not read March, if you haven't seen Fall Through, if you don't have Lies My Teacher Told Me on pre-order, I strongly suggest checking out his work, if for nothing else than seeing his wonderful transition from grayscale imagery to color imagery as he progresses as a cartoonist. It's truly a landmark moment in the art medium. If you like what you hear, you should tune in the future. We have our next episode coming on April 24th with Amanda Hughes, who is the owner of the ice cream stand in Syracuse, New York. And if you're thinking to yourself, why on earth are we talking about ice cream? Well, I would argue that we're not actually talking about ice cream. We're talking about building community spaces. And Amanda does such an amazing job with that with her business. So tune in, check out episode 20 whole episodes, woo! And hear the amazing thing that Amanda has to say. Lastly, if you like what you hear, please consider rating, reviewing the show on your favorite podcast apps, or follow me on social media. You can find The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook and Instagram, where I post about my pinball company, my life in academia, and obviously working on this podcast. So once again, The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook and Instagram is there for you whenever you need it. And as always, make space for conversation because you just might learn something. Oh yeah, and please have an awesome day.